The March wind cut through the Nevada desert like a knife made of ice, carrying with it the smell of sagebrush and the promise of a late spring snow. Catherine Brennan, Kate to anyone who had ever known her before, grief had carved her face into something harder, stood in front of what the locals called the Whisper House, and she understood immediately why no one had wanted it. It wasn't just that the building looked like it had been built to die. It wasn't just the way the wooden boards had warped and grayed under decades of brutal sun and winter freeze. It wasn't even the reputation, though God knew that was bad enough. No, what made Kate's stomach clench was something beyond fear, was simpler. The house looked like it was waiting for something. She was 30 years old, though she felt ancient. 6 months ago, she'd been a miner's wife with 7 children and a future that seemed, if not bright, at least survivable. Then Thomas had gone into the Silver Crown mine for his shift and had never come out. The cave-in had been catastrophic. 12 men dead, including her husband, their bodies never recovered, entombed forever in Nevada rock. Walter Morrison, Thomas's older brother, had waited exactly 2 weeks after the funeral before he'd come calling with attorney Henry Caldwell in tow. Walter was a prosperous man by Silver Ridge standards. He owned shares in 3 mines and had his fingers in half the businesses in town. Caldwell was sleek, well-fed, with the kind of smile that made Kate think of a coyote circling a wounded rabbit. "Kate," Walter had said, settling his bulk into the best chair in her small miner's cottage, "we need to talk about Thomas' debts." There had been no debts. Thomas had been careful, almost obsessively so, keeping meticulous records of every penny earned and spent. But Walter had produced papers, gambling markers, bills of sale for equipment that Thomas had supposedly purchased on credit, loans that Kate had never heard of. All of it adding up to more than Thomas's share of the family mining claim was worth. "This is a lie," Kate had said, her voice steady despite the terror crawling up her spine. "Thomas didn't gamble. He didn't—" "Are you calling my client a liar?" Caldwell had interrupted smoothly, his voice carrying just enough threat to make the question dangerous. "Because these documents are all properly notarized and witnessed. If you'd like to contest them in court, that's certainly your right. Of course, legal proceedings take time and money. And in the meantime, the interest on these debts continues to compound." The trap had been elegant in its cruelty. Kate couldn't afford a lawyer. She couldn't afford to wait months for a court date while her children starved. And everyone in Silver Ridge knew that Caldwell owned the judge anyway. The same judge who'd presided over a dozen similar cases where widows had lost everything to legitimate debts that materialized conveniently after their husbands died. "I'm being generous," Walters had continued. "I'll buy out Thomas's share of the claim for $5,000. That'll clear the debts and leave you with, well, enough to start over somewhere else." $5,000 for a claim that was worth at least $20,000. Highway robbery dressed up in legal language. But Kate had 7 children to feed and no other option. She'd signed, watching Walter's satisfied smile and hating him with a purity of emotion that surprised her. With that $5,000, blood money, though no blood showed on the bills, Kate had exactly one choice: the Whisper House. Every other property in Silver Ridge or the surrounding area was either too expensive or already snapped up by the mining companies for worker housing. The Whisper House had been on the market for years, its price dropping steadily as its reputation grew darker. The house was 3 miles outside of Silver Ridge, accessible only by a rough wagon road that became impassable in winter. It had been built in the 1880s during the first silver boom, abandoned in the 1890s when the boom went bust, and had stood empty ever since. People said it was haunted. They said the ground beneath it was cursed. They said that anyone who spent a night there could hear a voice whispering through the floorboard, calling them down into the earth. Kate didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in survival. Now, standing in front of the house with her 7 children clustered behind her and everything she owned packed into the wagon, Kate took stock of what she'd bought with her stolen inheritance. The house was 2 stories, though the upper floor had partially collapsed on one side. The wood siding had once been painted white, but was now a leprous gray, boards warping away from their frames. Several windows were broken, others intact, but so filthy they looked like cataracts. The front porch sagged dangerously, and the door hung slightly ajar, as if the house were exhaling. Behind her, she heard Daniel's wet, rasping cough, the same cough that had been getting worse for weeks, the kind of cough that turned into pneumonia if you didn't have money for a doctor. The boy was 12, tall for his age but painfully thin, and Kate could hear in that cough the sound of her own failure to protect him. "Mama," Rose whispered. Or was it Lily? Kate could usually tell her 8-year-old twins apart, but grief and exhaustion had blurred the edges of everything. "Mama, it looks scary." "It looks like home," Kate said firmly, though the lie tasted like ash. She shifted baby Grace higher on her hip. The infant was 6 months old and had known only poverty and loss in her short life, and reached for the crutch she kept propped against the wagon. Her left leg ended just below the knee, the result of a mining accident 3 years ago when she'd been working in the stamp mill and a piece of equipment had failed. The wooden prosthetic she'd been fitted with was crude and painful, so she mostly relied on the crutch, her gait a hobbling swing that had become as natural as breathing. "Daniel, Samuel, help unload the wagon," she ordered. "Rose, Lily, take Margaret and Patrick inside and start sweeping. I don't care if it's dirty. We need to get everything inside before the snow starts." The sky had been threatening all day, heavy clouds the color of old bruises rolling in from the west. March in Nevada was unpredictable. It could be 70 degrees one day and snowing the next. The wind was already picking up, carrying the sharp scent of coming precipitation. The children moved like small soldiers, accustomed to following orders without complaint. They'd learned in the 6 months since Thomas's death that survival required discipline. Margaret, at 4, tried to help carry a small bundle of blankets. Patrick, barely 2, toddle walked beside his sisters, too young to understand why their lives had shattered, but old enough to feel the fear radiating from the adults around him. Kate approached the front door, her crutch sinking slightly into the soft earth with each step. The wood of the porch groaned under her weight, a sound that made her heart skip, testing each board before committing her full weight. The door, when she pushed it fully open, released a smell that made her gag. It wasn't the clean smell of abandonment, of dust, dry wood. It was something else, something organic and wrong. The air that rolled out of the house was damp and cold despite the March warmth outside, carrying with it the smell of wet earth and something metallic, like old blood or rusted iron. It was the smell of rot, but not the rot of something that had died recently. This was the smell of something that had been dying for a very long time. "Stay back," Kate commanded, her voice sharp enough to freeze all 7 children in their tracks. She stepped across the threshold, letting her eyes adjust to the dimness in sight. The interior was worse than she'd feared, but not as bad as she'd imagined. The front room was large, dominated by a massive stone fireplace that looked solid despite years of neglect. The walls were still standing, though the wallpaper was peeling in long strips, revealing bare wood beneath. Furniture had been left behind, a table with 2 broken legs, some chairs, a dresser missing its drawers. But it was the floor that drew Kate's attention and made her skin crawl with an instinct she didn't understand. The floor wasn't dirt, it was wooden boards, wide planks that had been fitted together with some care. This was unusual for a house this remote. Most frontier buildings had packed earth floors, but these boards were warped and discolored, darkened not by age but by moisture, as if water or something else was constantly seeping up from below. Kate knelt awkwardly, balancing on her good leg and her crutch, and pressed her palm flat against one of the boards. It was cold, not just cool from lack of sun, but cold in a way that felt deliberate, as if the house was trying to draw heat out of her hand. And beneath the cold, she felt something else, a vibration so faint it might have been her imagination, like the house itself was breathing. The boards were soft with rot in places, and the smell, that terrible smell of damp earth and metal, was rising from between the gaps. Kate stood quickly, nearly losing her balance, and called the children inside. They worked until dark, unloading the wagon and trying to make the house habitable. They swept out dirt and dead insects. They covered the broken windows with oilcloth they'd brought. They cleared mouse droppings and bird nests. They started a fire in the massive fireplace, using the wood they'd brought and some broken furniture. And for a while, the house almost felt warm. Kate had arranged the children's sleeping area in the main room as far from the walls as possible, creating a nest of blankets on the least damaged section of floor. She'd feed them the last of the bread and beans she'd brought from Silver Ridge, rationing portions that were too small and pretending she wasn't hungry when they asked why she wasn't eating. Daniel's cough had gotten worse during the day's exertion. He sat propped against their pile of belongings, his thin chest heaving with the effort of breathing. Kate could hear the rattle in his lungs, a wet, heavy sound that terrified her more than any ghost story. Without money for a doctor, without money for medicine, she was watching her son slowly suffocate, and there was nothing she could do. "Mama," Lily whispered that night, after Kate had sung them all to sleep and was sitting by the dying fire. "What's under the floor?" Kate looked at her daughter, seeing Thomas's eyes in the child's face, and felt her heart break all over again. "Nothing, sweetheart, just the ground. Now sleep." But Kate knew that was a lie. She'd felt that vibration, smelled that smell. There was something under the floor, and it wasn't just earth. The fire burned down to embers. Kate added the last of their wood, knowing they'd have to find more tomorrow or freeze. The house settled around them with the normal groans and creaks of an old building, and Kate tried to tell herself that was all she was hearing. Then, just as she was starting to doze against the stone of the fireplace, warm despite her exhaustion, she heard it scrape. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from beneath the floor. Not from the walls, not from outside, from below. It was the sound of something heavy being dragged across stone, deliberate and slow. Scrape. Kate's eyes snapped open. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She looked around the room, checking that all 7 children were accounted for, still sleeping in their nest of blankets. Daniel coughed in his sleep but didn't wake. Scrape. The sound came again, this time from a different spot in the room, as if whatever was making it had moved. Kate grabbed her crutch and stood, every muscle tense, staring at the floor as if she could see through the boards to whatever was beneath. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, as if the house itself was waiting to see what she would do. Kate didn't sleep that night. She sat with her back against the fireplace, the firelight casting dancing shadows across the warped floorboard, and she listened. Sometimes she heard nothing but wind and the settling of old wood. Sometimes she heard that dragging, scraping sound, moving beneath the floor like something prowling. By the time gray dawn light filtered through the filthy windows, Kate had made a decision. Whatever was under this floor, ghost, rat, or structural problem, she would face it. She had no choice. This house was all they had, and she would either make it safe or die trying. She had 7 7 children depending on her, and she'd already lost too much to give up now. The morning brought no relief from the oppressive atmosphere of the Whisper House. If anything, daylight only made the decay more visible. The water stains on the walls that seemed to form faces if you looked at them too long, the way shadows pulled in corners, even when the sun streamed through the window, the persistent damp cold that rose from the floor no matter how much they tried to warm the room. Kate sent the older children out to gather wood and kindling while she tended to the younger ones and tried to assess their situation with the cold clarity of desperation. Their supplies were running dangerously low. The bread was gone. They had perhaps 3 days' worth of beans and a little bit of salt pork. The well behind the house, she checked it at first light, was deep in the water dark, tasting of minerals and something else she couldn't identify. She boiled it before letting the children drink, but she didn't trust it. Daniel's cough was worse. The boy had developed a fever during the night, his forehead burning hot while his body shook with cold. Kate had seen this before in other miners' children. Pneumonia, the killer of the poor, claiming lives when there was no money for doctors or medicine. Her son was dying in front of her, and she had $37 left from the $5,000 Walter had paid her. $37 in a house that smelled like a grave. "Mama," Rose said, returning from her wood gathering with her arms full of sage and dried branches. "There are footprints around the house." Kate's blood went cold. "What kind of footprints?" "Old ones, I think, in the snow that fell last night, but they go all around the house, like someone was walking in circles." Kate took her crutch and made her way outside, moving as quickly as her damaged leg would allow. The snow Rose had mentioned was barely more than a dusting, already melting in the morning sun, but it was enough to show what the girl had seen, a trail of footprints, definitely human, circling the house. But when Kate examined them more closely, her fear transformed into something else: confusion. The prints were indeed old, half melted and refrozen, probably from before they'd arrived, and they didn't lead away from the house or toward any road. They simply stopped, as if whoever had made them had walked in circles around the Whisper House and then vanished, or gone inside. The scraping sound that night was louder. Kate had been expecting it, had been listening for it, and when it came, she was ready. The children were asleep, exhausted from their labors, Daniel's breathing a wet rattle that tore at her heart. Kate stood as much as she could stand with one leg in a crutch and moved to the center of the room, to the spot where the smell was strongest and the boards most warped. "I know you're down there," she said quietly, not wanting to wake the children. "I don't know what you are or what you want, but this is my house now. My children are dying. If you want to hurt us, go ahead. We've got nothing left to lose." The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, as if the entire house was holding its breath. Then, from directly beneath where she stood, came 3 sharp knocks, deliberate, rhythmic, unmistakable. Someone or something was answering her. Kate's hands shook. She lowered herself awkwardly to her knees, pressing her ear against the cold board. She could hear nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat. But that vibration was there, stronger now, pulsing through the wood like a heartbeat that wasn't hers. She reached for the nearest board, one of the most rotted, soft and spongy with moisture. She didn't think about what she was doing. She didn't plan it. She simply grabbed the board with both hands and pulled. The wood came away with a wet, tearing sound. The smell that rolled up from the darkness below was overwhelming. Earth and metal and age, but not death, not decay. It was the smell of something that had been sealed away for a very long time. Kate grabbed her lantern and held it over the hole she'd created. The light revealed what the darkness had been hiding. Not earth, not a crawl space, but empty space. There was a cellar beneath the house, a cellar that wasn't in any description she'd been given, a cellar that had been deliberately hidden. "Mama?" Daniel's voice, weak and rasping, came from behind her. The boy had woken, drawn by the sound. "Mama, what did you find?" Kate looked at her sick son, at his fever-bright eyes, and made a decision that would change everything. "I found a way down," she said, "and tomorrow we're going to see what's waiting for us. Because whatever was in that cellar, ghost, treasure, or trap, it had been trying to get her attention. And Kate Brennan had learned long ago that when something demands your attention, you'd better pay it or it will take what it wants anyway." The house breathed around them, and Kate felt, for the first time since Thomas's death, something that might have been hope, or might have been madness. Either way, she would descend into that darkness, because she had 7 children who needed her to be brave, and bravery was the only currency she had left. Dawn came cold and gray, filtering through the filthy windows of the Whisper House like water through gauze. Kate had not slept. She'd spent the night sitting beside the hole she'd torn in the floor, the lantern burning low beside her, staring into darkness that stared back. The scraping sound had not returned after those 3 deliberate knocks, but the silence that replaced it was somehow worse, a waiting silence, pregnant with expectation. Daniel's breathing had grown more labored during the night. The wet rattle in his chest was constant now, punctuated by coughing fits that left him gasping and pale. Kate had propped him up on their meager pile of blankets, knowing that lying flat would make the fluid in his lungs worse, and had watched helplessly as her firstborn son struggled for each breath. She'd seen this progression before in other miners' children. Without medicine, without proper care, Daniel had perhaps a week before the pneumonia consumed him entirely. The other children woke slowly, groaning with the stiffness of sleeping on a hard floor in a cold house. Baby Grace fussed until Kate nursed her, though Kate's milk was thinning from lack of food and stress. The twins, Rose and Lily, huddled together for warmth. Samuel, at 6, tried to be brave, though his stomach growled audibly. Margaret, only 4, cried quietly until Lily picked her up and held her. Patrick, 2 years old, simply stared at nothing with eyes that had grown too large for his small face. They were starving. Not the dramatic starvation of immediate crisis, but the slow, grinding starvation of poverty. The kind that took weeks to kill, but was no less deadly for its patience. Kate had stretched their food as far as it would go, but there was no more stretching left. They had eaten the last of the beans for breakfast, rationed into portions so small they only emphasized the emptiness rather than filled it. "Mama," Samuel said, his voice small and uncertain, "I'm still hungry." Kate closed her eyes against the pain of those words. "I know, sweetheart, I know." She had $37. It would take at least $5 to hire a wagon to take her to Silver Ridge and back. Food for 7 children for even a week would cost at least $20. That left $12 for medicine for Daniel, if medicine could even be found. And then they'd be right back where they started, slowly starving in a house that breathed. Unless there was something in the cellar, something that could help them. Kate looked at the hole in the floor, at the darkness that pooled there like spilled ink. Every instinct told her it was dangerous to go down, to take her children into the belly of a house that was already trying to kill them with cold and damp. But every instinct also told her that they would die if she did. "Daniel," she said, keeping her voice steady and authoritative, "I need you to watch your brothers and sisters. I'm going down into the cellar to see what's there." The boy nodded, too weak to argue, understanding in his fever-bright eyes that this was necessary. Kate could see Thomas in him, could see the man he would have become if she could just keep him alive long enough. "Rose, Lily, if anything happens, if I'm not back up in an hour, you take the children and you walk to Silver Ridge. You go to the church and you ask for help. Do you understand?" The twins nodded, their identical faces set with determination that broke Kate's heart. They were 8 years old. They should have been playing with dolls, not preparing to be orphaned. Kate lowered herself to the edge of the hole, her crutch beside her and the lantern in one hand. The opening she'd created was perhaps 2 feet square, large enough to fit through, but barely. The darkness below was absolute, the lantern's light seeming to die just a few feet down, swallowed by shadow that felt almost solid. There was no ladder. Of course there wasn't. Whatever the cellar was, it had been hidden deliberately, meant to be forgotten. But Kate could see rough marks in the earth walls, handholds carved into the packed dirt leading down. Someone had made a way to descend, and if they could do it, so could she. She handed the lantern down first, lowering it on a rope they had used to tie their belongings. The light revealed the bottom, perhaps 12 feet down, dirt floor, stone wall, no bodies, no treasure immediately visible, just empty space and that smell of earth and metal. Kate took a breath, gathered her courage, and began to climb down. It was harder with one leg, every movement requiring her to compensate, to balance on her good leg while reaching for the next handhold. Her wooden prosthetic was more hindrance than help, and halfway down she simply let it fall, hearing it hit the dirt floor with a hollow thud. She'd retrieve it when she reached the bottom. The descent took longer than it should have. Her arms shook with effort, her good leg cramped, but she made it, finally stepping onto solid ground and taking stock of where she was. The cellar was not large, perhaps 15 feet square. The walls were stone, carefully fitted, professional work that spoke of someone with skill and resources. The floor was packed earth, hard and dry despite the moisture that plagued the house above. There was no furniture, no obvious storage. The space appeared empty, but it wasn't. Kate could feel that immediately. The air down here was different, not the damp, rotting air of the house above, but dry and still, preserved like something in a tomb. And that smell of metal was stronger here, sharp and almost electric on her tongue. Kate retrieved her prosthetic and strapped it back on, then raised the lantern high, searching the walls more carefully. The stone was gray and unremarkable except for one thing. On the eastern wall, someone had scratched words into the rock. They were faint, almost invisible, but Kate could make them out by holding the lantern close. "To whoever finds this, I am Beatrice Walsh. This house is my witness." 1890. Kate's heart hammered. 1890. 20 years ago. This cellar had been hidden for 20 years, and someone named Beatrice Walsh had been here, had carved this message. There was more writing, smaller and harder to read. "Look beneath where the fire burned." Kate turned, her mind racing. Where the fire burned. The fireplace upstairs, the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main room. She'd been so focused on the floor, on the obvious source of the smell and the sound, that she hadn't thought to examine the one permanent structure in the house. But first, she needed to see if there was anything else down here. She began a systematic search of the cellar, running her hands along the stone walls, looking for seams or hidden compartments. The work was slow, frustrating. Her hands came away dirty, her nails breaking against the rough stone. It was Samuel's voice from above that made her look up. "Mama! Mama! Someone's coming!" Kate's blood turned to ice. She scrambled for the handholds, climbing up with a speed that made her muscles scream, emerging into the main room to find all 7 children clustered at the window, staring out at the road. A wagon was approaching. Even from a distance, Kate could see it wasn't a supply wagon or a neighbor making a friendly call. call. It was moving too deliberately, too purposefully, and she recognized the horse, a black gelding that belonged to Henry Caldwell. Walter and his lawyer had come calling, and Kate had a feeling it wasn't a social visit. "Children upstairs. Now," Kate commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Take the baby. Hide in the back room. Don't come out until I tell you it's safe." "But Mama," Rose started. "Now!" The children scattered, their feet pounding on the stairs. Kate positioned herself in front of the hole in the floor, using an old piece of canvas to cover it as best she could. Her heart raced, but her hands were steady. She'd been preparing for this moment since Walter had stolen her husband's claim. She just hadn't expected it to come so soon. The wagon stopped outside. Kate heard boots on the porch, then a heavy knock on the door. 3 sharp raps that felt like an echo of the knock she'd heard from beneath the floor. The irony wasn't lost on her. She opened the door. Walter Morrison stood there, his bulk filling the doorway. Henry Caldwell behind him, looking like a vulture waiting for something to die. Both men's eyes swept the room, taking in the poverty, the decay, the evidence of desperate habitation. "Kate," Walter said, his voice carrying false concern. "We heard you'd moved out here. Wanted to check that you and the children were settling in." "We're fine," Kate said, keeping her body in the doorway, not inviting them inside. "Thank you for your concern." Caldwell's thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "Mrs. Brennan, we've received some complaints from neighbors about this property. Concerns about its condition, about whether it's safe for children." "What neighbors?" Kate asked flatly. "We're 3 miles from town. There are no neighbors." "Nevertheless," Caldwell continued smoothly, "the county has authority to inspect properties and ensure they meet basic standards of habitability. We're here in an official capacity." It was a lie, but it was a lie wrapped in enough legal language to give them authority if Kate pushed back. And if they came inside, if they saw how desperate their situation was, they could take her children, could claim she was an unfit mother, could finish what they'd started by stealing Thomas's claim. Kate's hand tightened on her crutch. She was one woman with one leg against 2 men who controlled half the county, but she'd be damned if she'd let them inside her house. "You can inspect from the doorway," she said. "I'm not letting you inside." Walter's face darkened. "Now, Kate, don't be difficult. We're trying to help." "The way you help by stealing my husband's claim," Kate interrupted, her voice low and dangerous. "The way you help by forcing me to sell for a fraction of what it was worth, that kind of help, those were legal transactions," Caldwell said, his voice hardening. "And if you continue to make slanderous accusations, then what?" Kate challenged. "You'll take my children? You will have me arrested? Go ahead, but you're not coming inside my house." For a long moment, the 3 of them stood frozen in a tableau of mutual hostility. Then Walter stepped back, his face twisted with anger, barely held in check. "We'll be back," he said, "with the sheriff, and then you won't have a choice." They left, the wagon pulling away in a cloud of dust. Kate stood in the doorway until they were out of sight, then closed the door and leaned against it, her whole body shaking with reaction. She had perhaps a day, maybe 2, before they returned with legal authority to force their way inside. Whatever was in this house, whatever Beatrice Walsh had hidden here, Kate needed to find it now because it was the only chance she had. "Children," she called up the stairs, "come down. We have work to do." The rest of that day was spent in frantic activity. Kate couldn't go back down into the cellar, not with the children needing her, not with Daniel's cough getting worse by the hour. But she could follow the clue Beatrice had left, look beneath where the fire burned. The massive stone fireplace dominated the eastern wall of the main room. Kate had assumed it was solid stone, built directly onto the foundation. But now, examining it more carefully with her fingers and a hammer she'd found in the abandoned furniture, she realized something. The hearthstones were loose. They'd been laid carefully to look permanent, but they weren't mortared in place. They could be lifted. Kate worked at them with the hammer and her bare hands, her fingers bleeding as she pried at the edge. Daniel, too weak to help much, sat beside her and held the lantern. The other children clustered around, watching with wide eyes as their mother destroyed their only source of heat in pursuit of something she couldn't name. The first stone came loose with a grinding sound that reminded Kate horribly of the scraping she'd heard beneath the floor. Beneath it was not earth, but empty space, a cavity carved into the foundation itself, about 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide. And inside that cavity was a metal box. It was not large, perhaps the size of a bread box, but it was heavy. Kate pulled it out with shaking hands, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. The box was made of tin, sealed but not locked, covered in a layer of dust so thick it obscured whatever markings might have been on it. Kate wiped the dust away and saw words stamped into the metal. B.W. 1890. Beatrice Walsh. This was her. This was what she'd hid. Kate pried open the lid. Inside was not gold, not jewels, but something both more and less valuable. Paper. A bundle of letters tied with string. A ledger book, its pages covered in neat handwriting. And beneath those, wrapped in oilcloth, a stack of money. Old bills, but still legal tender. Kate counted them with trembling hands. $900. It was a fortune. It was medicine for Daniel. It was food. It was time. But the letters, Kate picked them up carefully, seeing her own desperation reflected in the careful handwriting of a woman who'd been dead for 20 years. The first letter began, "My name is Beatrice Walsh, and this house is my testimony." Kate read by lantern and light while her children pressed close, trying to understand. Beatrice's story unfolded in careful, elegant script, a story that was horrifyingly familiar. Beatrice Walsh Walsh had owned this land with her younger brother Robert. They discovered a silver vein on the property in 1889, a small claim but potentially valuable. Beatrice had been the one to file the paperwork, to hire the miners, to manage the operation. Robert had been the public face because in 1889, no one took a woman mine owner seriously. The betrayal had been swift and brutal. Robert, with the help of attorney Henry Caldwell, the same Caldwell who just left Kate's port, had forged documents transferring ownership entirely to himself. He'd taken the silver they'd already extracted and disappeared, leaving Beatrice with nothing but debt and a house that had suddenly acquired a reputation for being haunted. The hauntings, Beatrice wrote, were Robert's doing. He'd spread rumors to keep people away from the property, to ensure no one would ever discover what he'd done. He'd paid men to walk around the house at night, to make noises, to create the legend of the Whisper House. Beatrice had died alone in 1891, 1 year after writing these letters. She'd hidden the evidence of Robert's theft, the forged documents, the ledger showing the real accounting of the mine, letters from Caldwell arranging the fraud, and $900 that she'd managed to save. She'd hidden it all beneath the fireplace and carved her message in the cellar, hoping that someday someone would find it. Someone had. Kate Brennan, 20 years later, another widow robbed by the same lawyer who'd helped destroy Beatrice. The pattern was clear. Caldwell, or perhaps his father, she'd need to check the date, had been doing this for decades, finding widows, finding ways to steal their years of property, always operating just within the law, but miles outside of justice. Kate looked at the $900 in her hands. It was enough to save Daniel, enough to buy food, enough to buy them time to figure out what to do next. But it was also evidence that Walter Morrison and Henry Caldwell had come from a long line of thieves, evidence that could destroy them if Kate was brave enough to use it. "Mama?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible over the rattle in his chest. "What does it mean?" Kate looked at her 7 children, hungry, scared, clinging to survival by their fingernails. She looked at the letters in her hand, the testimony of a woman who died demanding justice that never came. "It means," Kate said, her voice steady despite the fury building in her chest, "that we're going to town tomorrow. We're going to get you medicine. And then we're going to make sure that what happened to Beatrice Walsh, what happened to us, never happens to anyone else ever again." She had $900. She had evidence of a crime. She had 7 children who needed her to be strong. And she had nothing left to lose. Kate spent that night reading every word Beatrice Walsh had written. The children slept fitfully around her, Daniel's breathing a constant wet rattle, baby Grace fussing until Kate nursed her with milk that felt thinner each day. The other 5 curled together for warmth. The fire had burned down to embers after Kate had destroyed the hearth to reach the hidden box, and the March cold crept through every crack in the Whisper House wall. But Kate barely felt the cold. She was burning with something else, a fury that had been building since the moment Walter Morrison had walked into her home with his forged papers and stolen her life. Now, reading Beatrice's careful documentation, seeing the same pattern repeated 20 years ago, that fury crystallized into something harder, sharper. Purpose. Beatrice's ledger was meticulous. Every ounce of silver extracted from the small mine on the property, every expense, every transaction, and most importantly, every payment to H.C., Henry Caldwell, or perhaps his father. The Caldwells, it seemed, had been facilitating theft in this county for at least 2 generations. But the ledger told another story too, one that made Kate's heart race. The mine hadn't been exhausted when Robert Walsh had stolen it. According to Beatrice's final entries, there was still silver in the ground. Not a fortune, but enough to make the property valuable. Enough that Robert had needed to steal it quickly before Beatrice could realize what she had, which meant the mine might still be there, sealed or hid somewhere on this property. Kate looked at the hole in the floor, at the cellar she'd discovered. She thought about Beatrice's message. This house is my witness, not her memorial, not her grave, her witness. The house itself was evident, and Kate was only beginning to understand what it was testifying to. As dawn broke gray and cold, Kate made her decisions with the methodical precision of someone who'd already lost everything and therefore had nothing left to fear. The $900 would be divided, $200 for immediate supplies and medicine, $700 hidden for the legal battle she knew was coming. The letters and ledger would be copied. She'd need help with that, someone she could trust. But the evidence was too valuable to risk in a single location, and she would find that mine, because if there was still silver in the ground, it was hers. Beatrice had bought this property legally. Robert had stolen it through fraud. And if Kate could prove that the original claim was fraudulent, that the property had been illegally transferred, then maybe, just maybe, she could do more than survive. She could win. "Daniel," she said gently, rousing her eldest son from feverish sleep, "I need you to be strong for a few more hours. We're going to town. I'm going to get you medicine." The boy nodded, too weak to speak, trust absolute in his fever-bright eyes. Kate dressed carefully for the trip to Silver Ridge. She wore her best dress, which wasn't saying much, but it was clean and mended. She hid $200 in a cloth bag tied inside her dress. She took Beatrice's letters and ledger and wrapped them in oilcloth, then hid that bundle in the bottom of a basket covered with what little food they had left. To anyone who looked, she was just a poor widow going to town for supplies. She left the older girl, Rose and Lily, in charge of the younger children with strict instructions. Keep the fire going. Keep everyone inside. If anyone comes to the door, don't answer it. I'll be back before dark." The twins nodded, their 8-year-old faces set with determination that broke Kate's heart. They were too young for this responsibility, but Kate had no choice. She couldn't bring all 7 children on the rough wagon road, couldn't risk them in town where Walter and Caldwell might see them and call the county authorities about unsafe conditions. She loaded Daniel into the small cart they'd brought from Silver Ridge, hardly more than a wheelbarrow with higher side, and began the 3-mile journey. Walking was hard with her crutch in the uneven ground, pulling the cart harder still, but she'd learned to push through pain. The wooden prosthetic chafed the stump of her leg until she could feel blood soaking through her stocking, but she didn't stop. They reached Silver Ridge by mid-morning. The town was small, perhaps 300 people when the mines were working full capacity. A collection of wooden buildings clustered around the main shaft of the Silver Crown mine. It was a company town in all but name, which meant that most people owed their livelihoods to the mine operators. And one of those operators was Walter Morrison. Kate's first stop was the doctor's office. Dr. Samuel Hewitt was an older man, competent but expensive, and he looked at Kate with thinly veiled skepticism when she carried Daniel through his door. "Mrs. Brennan," he said, his tone suggesting he already knew this would be a waste of his time. "What can I do for you?" "My son needs medicine," Kate said flatly. "He has pneumonia. I can pay." That last sentence changed everything. Hewitt's expression shifted from dismissal to professional interest. "Let me examine him." The examination was brief but thorough. Hewitt listened to Daniel's lungs, checked his fever, looked in his mouth and throat. His face grew grave. "Advanced pneumonia," he said finally. "Both lungs. I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Brennan. Even with medicine, his chances aren't good. He needs constant care, warmth, proper food. Medicine alone won't save him. But it might help," Kate said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. "What will it cost?" $20 for the medicine, another $5 for the consultation. $25, more than Kate had expected, but not impossible with the money she'd found. She pulled the bills from her hidden pocket, watching Hewitt's eyes widen at the sight of that much cash. "Where did you—" he started. "That's not your concern," Kate interrupted. "Can you help my son or not?" Hewitt took the money and prepared the medicine, a mixture of herbs and compounds that he claimed would help clear Daniel's lungs and reduce the fever. He gave Kate careful instructions about dosing and care, then added, almost as an afterthought, "You should bring him back in a week so I can check his progress." Kate nodded, knowing she couldn't afford another visit, but not wanting to argue. She had what she needed. Now for the harder part. Her next stop was the general store, where she bought supplies with brutal efficiency. Flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, lamp oil, matches. Everything they'd need to survive another month. The storekeeper, a nervous man named Patterson, who'd always been kind to her when Thomas was alive, packed everything carefully and only charged her fair price. Kate suspected he knew about Walter's theft, but was too afraid to say anything. As Patterson loaded her purchases into the cart, Kate asked casually, "Mr. Patterson, do you remember a woman named Beatrice Walsh? She would have lived here about 20 years ago." Patterson's hands stilled. His face went carefully blank. "Why do you ask?" "She owned the property I'm living on now. I found some of her things. I was curious about what happened to her." Patterson looked around nervously, making sure no one else was in the store. Then he leaned close and whispered, "You should stop asking questions about Beatrice Walsh. Nothing good comes from digging up the past." "Wait," Kate pressed. "What happened to her?" "She claimed her brother stole from her, claimed attorney Caldwell helped him. She died before anyone could investigate." Patterson's voice dropped even lower. "Some people thought it wasn't natural, her dying so young and convenient-like. But nobody wanted to cross Caldwell to find out." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Beatrice Walsh hadn't just died. She might have been murdered. And Henry Caldwell, who'd helped Robert Walsh steal from his sister, might have helped silence her permanently. Kate felt her blood run cold, but she kept her expression neutral. "Thank you, Mr. Patterson." She was loading the last of her supplies when she heard the voice she'd been dreading. Well, Kate Brennan, spending money like you've struck silver." Walter Morrison stood on the wooden sidewalk, Henry Caldwell beside him, both men's eyes fixed on Kate's cart with predatory interest. A small crowd was gathering. Silver Ridge was too small for anything to happen without witnesses. "My finances are none of your concern," Kate said evenly, continuing to secure her supplies. "But they are," Caldwell said smoothly, his lawyer's voice carrying just enough authority to sound official. "You told us you had no money, yet here you are, buying supplies, paying for expensive medicine. One might wonder where that money came from." Kate turned to face them, her crutch planted firmly, her back straight. She'd known this confrontation was coming, had prepared for it. "I found money hidden in the house. Previous owner must have left it. It's mine now." "Found money in that old ruin?" Walter laughed, but there was no humor in it. "That's quite a story." "It's the truth," Kate said. Then, because she couldn't resist, because the fury was bubbling up, she added, "The previous owner was Beatrice Walsh. Maybe you remember her, Mr. Caldwell? She had some interesting things to say in her letters." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Caldwell's face went white, then red. Walter looked confused, but Caldwell knew exactly what Kate was implying. For just a moment, his professional mask slipped, and Kate saw naked fear in his eyes. "I don't know what you think you found," Caldwell started. "I think I found evidence," Kate interrupted, her voice carrying across the growing crowd. "Evidence that Beatrice Walsh was robbed. Evidence of who helped rob her. Evidence that some people in this town town have been stealing from widows for 20 years. The crowd murmured. This was better than any theater, more scandalous than any gossip. Walter grabbed Caldwell's arm, pulling him aside, and the two men had a whispered, heated conversation while Kate finished loading her cart. She'd played her hand, shown them she had Beatrice's letters. It was a risk. They might try to steal them, might try to silence her the way they'd silenced Beatrice. But Kate was counting on the fact that they couldn't know how much evidence she had or where she'd hidden it. They'd have to be careful now. They'd have to wonder. Kate had heard stories of similar discoveries in abandoned mining towns across Nevada. In Idaho, just 2 years ago in 1908, another widow had uncovered a hidden cache beneath her purchased homestead that transformed her family's desperate situation. That remarkable story of perseverance and hidden wealth had inspired miners' widows across the West. But the full details of that woman's discovery are the subject of another video. She was halfway out of town when she heard hoofbeats behind her. Kate's hand went instinctively to the knife she kept in her dress pocket. But it wasn't Walter or Caldwell who caught up to her. It was Dr. Hewitt riding a horse that looked too expensive for a town doctor's salary. "Mrs. Brennan," he called, pulling up beside her. "A word, if you please." Kate stopped, wary, keeping the cart between them. "What is it, doctor?" Hewitt dismounted, his face troubled. "I heard what you said to Caldwell about Beatrice Walsh, about evidence." He looked around, making sure they were alone on the road. "I was just starting my practice here when Beatrice died. I was the one who examined her body." Kate's heart began to race. And I had questions," Hewitt said quietly. "Questions about how a healthy woman in her 30s suddenly died of heart failure. Questions no one wanted answered because Caldwell controlled the county coroner. I was young, I was new to town, and I was told very clearly that asking questions was bad for business. Why are you telling me this now? Because I saw your son. Because I see what you're trying to do, trying to keep your children alive in that death trap of a house." Hewitt reached into his coat, pulled out a folded paper. "This is a copy of my original examination note. The ones I was told to destroy. I kept them. I don't know what good they'll do you, but if you're fighting Caldwell, you'll need every weapon you can find." Kate took the paper with shaking hands. "Why help me?" "Because I've watched Henry Caldwell destroy lives for 20 years, and I'm tired of being a coward," Hewitt said simply. "Be careful, Mrs. Brennan. They killed Beatrice Walsh. Keep her quiet. They won't hesitate to kill you." He mounted his horse and rode away before Kate could respond, leaving her standing on the dusty road with evidence of murder in her hands and her sick son coughing weakly in the cart beside her. The journey back to the Whisper House took twice as long as the trip into town. Kate's leg was bleeding badly now, the prosthetic rubbing the wound raw with each step. Daniel drifted in and out of consciousness, the medicine not yet having time to work. The supplies in the cart seemed to grow heavier with each mile, but Kate barely noticed. Her mind was racing, fitting pieces together. Beatrice had found silver. Beatrice had been robbed. Beatrice had gathered evidence. And Beatrice had died suspiciously right before she could use that evidence. Kate was following the exact same path. She'd found the silver, or at least the evidence of it. She'd been robbed. She'd gathered evidence. And now Caldwell and Walter knew she had it, which meant she had to move fast, had to find that mine, prove ownership, and get the evidence to someone who could use it before they could silence her the way they'd silenced Beatrice. The Whisper House came into view just as the sun was setting, its shadow stretching long across the desert scrub. Smoke rose from the chimney. The girls had kept the fire going. Kate felt a surge of pride in her children, followed immediately by terror at what she was putting them through. Rose and Lily ran out to help her unload, their faces bright with relief that she'd returned. Kate distributed the medicine to Daniel, according to Dr. Hewitt's instructions, then fed her children the first proper meal they had had in days: beans with salt pork, fresh bread, even a bit of sugar for sweetness. After the children were asleep, their stomachs finally full, Kate returned to the hole in the floor. She lit a lantern and descended into the cellar, this time bringing a proper spade she'd bought in town. If there was a mine on this property, it had to connect to this cellar somehow. Beatrice wouldn't have carved her message here otherwise. Kate began to examine the stone walls more carefully, looking not just for hiding places, but for seams, for places where the wall might not be wall at all. She worked by lantern light, her hands growing raw, her back aching, but she didn't stop. It was nearly midnight when she found it. On the western wall, what looked like solid stone was actually something else. A door made of stones fitted so perfectly together that the seams were invisible unless you knew to look for them. And once Kate found the seams, she found the mechanism, a stone that could be pushed inward, releasing a counterweight that allowed the door to swing open. Beyond was darkness. Not the darkness of an empty cellar, but the darkness of a tunnel, a mine shaft. The scraping sound she'd heard hadn't been a ghost. It had been this door settling on its hinges, responding to temperature changes or settling earth, scraping against the stone frame. The house had been trying to tell her all along. It had been whispering its secrets, waiting for someone to listen. Kate stood at the threshold, her lantern held high, staring into the darkness of the mine shaft that Beatrice Walsh had hidden from her thieving brother. The tunnel was roughly carved but properly shored with timber, professional work that had cost money and effort. It descended at a gentle angle, disappearing into earth that might contain silver, might contain nothing, might contain her family's salvation or doom. She would explore it, but not tonight, not when her children were alone upstairs, when Daniel was still fighting for his life, when she didn't didn't know if Walter and Caldwell were planning to return with force. Tomorrow she would descend into the earth and see what Beatrice Walsh had died protecting. Kate climbed back up to the main floor, sealed the hole with boards and canvas, and lay down beside her children. Daniel's breathing was already easier. The medicine was working. Kate allowed herself a moment of hope, fierce and bright in her chest. She had evidence of theft. She had evidence of murder. She had $700 hidden in a mine that might still hold silver. She had 7 children who needed her to be brave. And she had the Whisper House, which had kept Beatrice's secrets for 20 years and had chosen to share them with Kate. The house breathed around them, and for the first time, Kate felt like it was breathing in time with her own heart. Not haunted, not cursed, just waiting, just witnessing, just ready to testify. Daniel's fever broke on the 3rd day. Kate woke to find him sitting up on his own, his eyes clear for the first time in weeks, asking for food with a voice that didn't rattle with fluid. The medicine Dr. Hewitt had prescribed was working, slowly but working. The boy was still weak, still needed weeks of care and proper nutrition, but he would live. Kate held him close and let herself cry for the first time since Thomas had died. They were tears of relief so profound it was almost painful. Tears she couldn't afford to shed when the other children were watching, when she needed to be strong. But now in the gray dawn light, with her firstborn son breathing clearly in her arms, she allowed herself this moment of weakness. It didn't last long. Reality reasserted itself with the rumble of Samuel's empty stomach and baby Grace's hungry cry. They had food now. The supplies from town would last them perhaps 3 weeks if Kate rationed carefully. But 3 weeks wasn't forever. The $700 she'd hidden would buy them time, but time for what? To slowly starve in a house that was falling apart? To wait for Walter and Caldwell to return with the sheriff and legal papers that would take her children away? No. Kate had made her decision during those 3 days of nursing Daniel, watching the medicine work its slow magic, reading and rereading Beatrice Walsh's letters by lamplight. She would find that mine. She would prove it existed, prove it still held silver, and use that proof to reclaim what had been stolen from Beatrice and from her. But she couldn't do it alone. Not anymore. On the morning of the 4th day, Kate made the difficult decision to leave her children again. She dressed carefully, hiding Beatrice's letters and Dr. Hewitt's examination notes in the lining of her coat. She took $50 from her hidden cash, enough for what she needed to do, not so much that losing it would be catastrophic. And she loaded all 7 children into the cart. "Where are we going, Mama?" Rose asked, helping to settle baby Grace between blankets. "To church," Kate said simply. The First Methodist Church of Silver Ridge was the only building in town that Walter Morrison didn't control. Pastor William Davies was an old man, stern and righteous, who'd been preaching in Nevada mining towns since before the silver boom. He was known for 2 things: his fierce sermons against greed and corruption, and his absolute refusal to be bought or intimidated. Kate had gambled that his reputation was deserved. Now she would find out. The church was small, whitewashed wood with a simple cross above the door. Kate arrived just as the morning service was ending, waiting outside until the congregation filed out. She saw curious looks, some sympathetic, others hostile. She saw Walter Morrison near the back, his face darkening when he spotted her. She saw Henry Caldwell standing apart from the others, watching her with the cold calculation of a predator studying prey. She waited until they'd all left before approaching Pastor Davies as he stood at the door bidding his parishioners farewell. "Pastor," Kate said, "I need sanctuary." Davies was in his 70s, white-haired and thin, but his eyes were sharp as he studied her. "Sanctuary is for criminals fleeing justice, Mrs. Brennan. Are you a criminal?" "No, sir, but I'm a widow with 7 children who's being hunted by men who stole my husband's property and want to finish the job." Kate gestured to her children clustered behind her. "I need a safe place for them while I do what needs to be done. I can pay." She pulled out $20, a fortune for a church in a small mining town, and held it out. Davies didn't take it. "Keep your money," he said. "Tell me why you need protection." So Kate told him. Standing on the church steps with her children listening and the Nevada wind whipping dust around them, she told Pastor Davies about Thomas's death and the 4 debts. She told him about the Whisper House and Beatrice Walsh's letters. She told him about evidence of fraud going back 20 years, about a woman who died suspiciously right before she could expose Henry Caldwell. And she told him that she had proof, written proof, legal proof, but that she needed time to find the rest of what Beatrice had hidden. And she couldn't do that while protecting 7 children from men who'd already proven willing to kill. Davies listened without interrupting. When Kate finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Show me the proof." Kate pulled out Beatrice's letter. Davies read them standing there in the wind, his face growing harder with each page. When he reached Dr. Hewitt's examination notes, the one suggesting Beatrice's death wasn't natural, his hands began to shake. "Dear God," he whispered, "I preached at her funeral. I thought it was tragedy. I didn't know it was murder." "Will you help us?" Kate asked. Davies looked at her 7 children, hungry, scared, clinging to survival. He looked at Kate herself, standing on one leg in a crutch, asking not for charity, but for a chance to fight. And he made his decision. "Your children can stay in the church rectory," he said. "I'll tell anyone who asks that they're here for religious instruction. It's not technically sanctuary, but it's protection. No one will touch them while they're under the church's care." Kate felt her knees weaken with relief. "Thank you, Pastor." "Don't thank me yet," Davies said grimly. "If what you're suggesting is true, if Caldwell has been facilitating theft and murder for 20 years, then you're declaring war on the most powerful man in this county. That kind of war, Mrs. Brennan, people die. People are already dying, Kate said, looking at Daniel's still pale face. My son nearly died because we couldn't afford medicine for a disease he got from living in a house I was forced to buy. Beatrice Walsh died trying to expose the same crime. How many others, Pastor? How many other widows, other families, destroyed by men like Walter Morrison and Henry Caldwell? Davies nodded slowly. Then we fight, but carefully. Caldwell has the law on his side. I have the truth. Truth and law aren't always the same thing, Mrs. Brennan. You'll need more than letters. You'll need that mind. You'll need to prove it exists and that it's valuable enough to kill for. I know, Kate said. That's why I need you to keep my children safe while I go into that mine and find what Beatrice left behind. She spent an hour settling her children in the rectory, a small building behind the church with 2 rooms and a working stove. The church had food stores, Davies explained, donations from parishioners. The children would eat properly for the first time in months. They would be warm. They would be safe. Kate explained to them what she was doing, carefully, not wanting to frighten them, but needing them to understand. Mama has to go back to the house and do some work. You'll stay here with Pastor Davies. Daniel, you're in charge. Rose, Lily, you help him. Samuel, Margaret, Patrick, you mind your older sibling. And Grace, she kissed the baby's head. You just keep being perfect. When will you come back? Samuel asked, his 6-year-old face pinched with worry. Soon, Kate promised, hoping it was true. A few days at most, but I need to do this for us, for our future. Daniel, still weak but understanding more than the others, nodded. Be careful, Mom. Always, Kate lied. She left while the children were eating lunch before she could lose her nerve. Pastor Davies walked her to the door. Mrs. Brennan, he said quietly, if you find what you're looking for, if you find proof that the mine exists and that Caldwell helped steal it, bring it to me immediately. Don't try to confront them yourself. We'll take it to the territorial governor if we have to. And if I don't find anything, Kate asked, then we use what we have, the letters, the examination notes, and we pray it's enough. Davies paused. There's one more thing. I knew Beatrice Walsh. Not well, but I knew her. She was tenacious, brave. Reminded me of you, actually. If she hid something in that mine, something valuable enough to die for, she didn't do it carelessly. Be careful down there, Miss Brennan. Mines are dangerous even without the weight of 20-year-old secrets. Kate rode the cart back to the Whisper House in the afternoon, making good time without 7 children to slow her down. The house looked different now, less threatening, more like a puzzle box waiting to be opened. She'd sent her children away to safety. She'd secured an ally in Pastor Davies. She'd taken the first legal steps toward proving the fraud. Now came the dangerous part. Kate unloaded the supplies she'd brought, lamp oil, extra candle, rope, a proper miner's pick she'd purchased from Patterson's store along with some suspicious looks. She ate a cold meal standing up, not wanting to waste time on cooking. And as the sun began to set, painting the Nevada sky in shades of orange and purple, Kate descended into the cellar for the 3rd time. The hidden door in the stone wall was easier to open now that she knew the trick. The counterweight mechanism worked smoothly, testament to whoever had engineered it, likely Beatrice herself or miners she'd hired. Beyond was the tunnel, and Kate stepped into it with her lantern held high and her heart hammering against her rib. The tunnel was perhaps 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, just large enough for miners to move through comfortably. The walls were rough cut but properly shored, with timber supports every 10 feet showing signs of careful maintenance. This hadn't been a hasty operation. Beatrice and Robert had invested time and money into this mine, which meant they'd believed it was worth the investment. Kate moved forward carefully, testing each step, watching for loose rock or rotten timber. The air was cool and dry, carrying that metallic smell she'd noticed in the cellar. Not iron, she realized now, but silver, the distinctive scent of silver ore, sharp and slightly bitter. The tunnel descended at a gentle angle for perhaps 50 feet, then leveled out into what looked like a small working chamber. Here, Kate found evidence of actual mining. Tool marks on the walls where ore had been extracted, a pile of broken rock in one corner, even an old wheelbarrow with a rotted wooden wheel. And on the far wall, barely visible in the lamplight, a seam of something that glittered. Kate moved closer, her hands shaking as she raised the lantern. The seam was perhaps 3 inches wide, running diagonally across the rock face at about chest height. It was dark gray, streaked with bright silver, or actual silver ore still in the ground. Beatrice hadn't lied. The mine wasn't exhausted. There was still wealth here, still value worth stealing, worth killing for. Kate used the pick she'd brought to chip away at the seam, working carefully, collecting samples in a cloth bag. She wasn't a miner, but Thomas had taught her enough over the years for her to recognize good ore when she saw it. This was good ore, not the richest she'd ever seen, but solid, consistent, the kind that could provide a steady income for years. She was so focused on her work that she almost missed the sound. Footsteps above her in the house. Kate froze, her heart stopping. Someone had entered the Whisper House. Multiple someones, judging by the heavy tread tread of boots on the wooden floor above. She'd been in the mine for perhaps an hour, long enough for someone to have watched her enter, to have waited for full darkness, to have come after her. Walter, it had to be Walter and Caldwell, come to finish what they'd started with Beatrice. Kate extinguished her lantern, plunging herself into absolute darkness. She stood perfectly still, hardly breathing, listening to the sounds from above. Voices muffled by earth and stone, but definitely voices. Men arguing about something. And then, clear as a bell, she heard boots on the cellar stairs. They'd found the entrance. They were coming down. Kate moved by touch and memory, backing deeper into the mine, away from the entrance. Her hands found the rock wall, followed it, feeling her way. She couldn't let them trap her in here. Couldn't let them block the entrance and leave her to suffocate in the dark. Had to find another way out. Had to. Her hand touched something unexpected. Not rock, wood, a door frame. Kate's fingers explored frantically, finding hinges, a handle, another door, this one leading deeper into the mine. Or perhaps, her heart leaped, another exit. Beatrice would have been smart enough to create a second way out, wouldn't she? A escape route in case Robert or anyone else tried to trap her? Kate pulled the door open as quietly as she could. Beyond was more darkness, but she felt air move, a breeze, faint but real, suggesting this passage led somewhere. She slipped through, pulling the door closed behind her, just as lamplight bloomed in the chamber she'd left, illuminating the silver seam she'd been examining. She was here, a voice said. Walter's voice, thick with triumph. Recent tool marks. She found the mine. Find her. Hi, Caldwell ordered, his lawyer's voice steady and cold. She can't have gone far. Check every passage. Kate moved deeper into the darkness, one hand on the wall, the other holding the cloth bag with her ore samples pressed tight against her chest. She had no light, no way to see where she was going, but she had no choice. Behind her was certain death. Ahead was just probable death, which meant it was the better option. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes narrowing until Kate had to squeeze through sideways, sometimes opening into larger chambers. She moved as quickly as she dared, putting distance between herself and her pursuers, praying this passage led somewhere other than a dead end. Behind her, she heard shouts, saw the flicker of lamplight in the distance. They were following, tracking her by sound, by the disturbed dust, by whatever trail she was leaving in the dark. Kate's crutch caught on something, a rock, a timber, she couldn't tell, and she fell hard, landing on her hands and knees, the cloth bag flying from her grip. She scrambled for it in the darkness, her hands finding rock and dirt, but not the bag, not the precious ore samples that were the only proof she had of the mine's value. Lamplight grew brighter behind her, voices closer. Kate abandoned the search for the bag and crawled forward, her wooden prosthetic scraping against rock, her good leg pushing her ahead through the darkness. And then her hand touched not rock, but wood, smooth wood, boards. Kate explored frantically with her finger. It was a door, a proper door with hinges and a handle, not a rough mine passage, but a deliberately constructed exit. She pulled herself up, grabbed the handle, twisted, pulled. The door swung open and Kate tumbled through into blessed, cool night air. She'd found it, Beatrice's escape route. A tunnel that led from the mine to an exit hidden somewhere on the property, far enough from the house that Robert wouldn't have known about. Kate scrambled to her feet, looking around wildly. She was behind the house, near the dry wash, perhaps 100 yards from the main building. She could see lamplight in the Whisper House's window, could see the faint glow from the cellar entrance. She'd escaped, but she'd lost her ore sample, lost the proof she'd gone into the mine to collect. All she had now was her word that the silver existed, and who would believe a desperate widow against men like Walter Morrison and Henry Caldwell? Kate stood in the Nevada night, breathing hard, her leg bleeding again, her dress torn, and made a decision. She couldn't go back to the house. They'd be watching it now. Couldn't lead them to the church where her children were. Couldn't risk being caught before she could get help. She had one option left, one gamble. Pastor Davies had told her to bring proof to him. She had no proof except the mine itself, so she would bring Davies to the mine, would bring witnesses, would expose the silver in daylight, with people watching, in a way that Walter and Caldwell couldn't prevent or deny. Kate began walking, not back towards Silver Ridge, but in a wide circle, giving the Whisper House a wide berth. Her legs screamed with pain, her lungs burned, but she kept moving, using the stars to navigate, heading toward town by the long route that would keep her hidden. By the time she reached the church, it was past midnight. Kate collapsed on the rectory steps, too exhausted to knock. Pastor Davies found her there at dawn, bloody and filthy, clutching a piece of rock she'd grabbed from the mine entrance in her desperate flight. It was barely an ounce of silver ore, but it was enough. They tried to kill me, Kate whispered as Davies helped her inside, just like they killed Beatrice. But I found it, Pastor. I found the mine, and tomorrow we're going to show everyone what those bastards have been hiding. Kate woke in a clean bed for the first time in months, her body aching in ways that went beyond simple exhaustion. Someone, probably the pastor's housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, an elderly Chinese woman who ran the church's charitable operations, had cleaned and bandaged her wounded leg, dressed her in a borrowed nightgown, and tucked her into the narrow bed in the rectory's spare room. Through the thin walls, Kate could hear her children's voices, arguing quietly about something, the familiar sound bringing tears to her eyes. They were safe. Whatever happened next, at least her children were safe. She sat up carefully, testing her injured leg. The pain was sharp but manageable, and the bandages were clean and professionally applied. Mrs. Mrs. Chen, it seemed, had nursing experience. Kate dressed slowly in the clothes that had been left for her, not her own torn and bloody dress, but something borrowed from the church's charity box. It was plain gray wool, mended but serviceable, and it fit well enough. When she emerged from the room, she found Pastor Davies waiting with breakfast, real breakfast, eggs and bread and coffee, and a grave expression on his weathered face. "You caused quite a stir last night," he said without preamble, showing up bloody and babbling about murder attempts. "Mrs. Chen wanted to fetch the doctor, but I told her we'd wait until you could explain yourself properly." Kate sat, suddenly ravenous, and ate while she told Davies everything that had happened in the mine. The silver seam, Walter and Caldwell's arrival, her desperate flight through the passages, the escape tunnel that Beatrice had built as insurance against exactly this kind of betrayal. When she finished, Davies sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled, his expression thoughtful. "You realize what you're proposing is dangerous? If we accuse Walter Morrison and Henry Caldwell of attempted murder based solely on your word—" "It's not just my word," Kate interrupted. She pulled the small piece of ore from her pocket, the rock she'd grabbed in her flight, barely conscious she was taking it. "This is from the mine. Any assayer can confirm it's silver ore. Any mining engineer can confirm that there's an active seam still in the ground. That proves Beatrice was telling the truth about the mine existing. And if the mine exists, then Robert Walsh stole something valuable and Caldwell helped him. That proves theft 20 years ago," Davies said carefully. "It doesn't prove attempted murder last night. You said yourself you didn't see who was in the house. Could you identify them in court?" Kate hesitated. She'd heard Walter's voice, heard Caldwell's orders, but in the darkness, without seeing their faces. "No," she admitted, "not definitively." "Then we can't accuse them of attempted murder." "Not yet." Davies leaned forward. "But we can do something else. We can force an investigation into Beatrice Walsh's death. We can demand that territorial authorities examine the mine and determine ownership. We can make so much noise, gather so many witnesses, that Caldwell and Morrison can't simply make you disappear the way they did Beatrice." "How?" Kate asked. "By making this public," Davies said, a fierce light in his old eye. "By turning your fight into a cause that the whole territory hears about. Henry Caldwell has been stealing from widows for 20 years because he's been able to do it quietly, one victim at a time, with no one to speak for. But you're going to speak, Mrs. Brennan, loud enough that everyone hears." Over the next 3 days, Pastor Davies transformed into something Kate hadn't expected. A brilliant strategy. He drafted letters to the territorial governor, to the Bureau of Mines, to newspapers in Carson City and Virginia City. He called in favors from other ministers across Nevada, men who'd been preaching against mining company corruption for years and were eager for a concrete case to support. He even contacted the Women's Christian Temperance Union, whose members had been advocating for widows' rights and were always looking for sympathetic causes. But most importantly, he organized witnesses. "The mine is on your property," Davies explained. "That means we have the legal right to inspect it. What we need is to inspect it publicly with so many witnesses that Caldwell can't claim we fabricated evidence. We need miners to confirm the silver is real. We need a surveyor to confirm the mine's extent. We need a lawyer, not Caldwell obviously, to document everything for legal proceedings. And we need regular citizens, people from Silver Ridge, to see for themselves that you're telling the truth." Kate listened, amazed at the man's tactile mind. "You've done this before." "I've been a minister in mining towns for 40 years, Davies said dryly. "I've seen every kind of corruption, every kind of theft, every way powerful men exploit the vulnerable. I've watched good people destroyed because they fought alone. You're not going to fight alone, Miss Brennan." On the 4th day after Kate's escape from the mine, Pastor Davies called a town meeting at the church. It was Sunday, which meant good attendance, but the real draw was the rumor Davies had carefully spread, that Kate Brennan had evidence of fraud involving Henry Caldwell and Walter Morrison, and that she was prepared to present that evidence publicly. The church was packed. Kate stood at the front, her children seated in the first pew, and faced a crowd that ranged from sympathetic to hostile. She saw miners who'd worked with Thomas, their faces carefully neutral. She saw other widows, women who understood too well what Kate had suffered. She saw Walter Morrison in the back, his face red with barely controlled rage, and she saw Henry Caldwell sitting calmly in the middle, his expression one of amused tolerance, as if this were all a minor inconvenience he was enduring out of politeness. Pastor Davies spoke first, framing the issue carefully. "We're here today because a member of our congregation, Mrs. Catherine Brennan, has made serious allegations. Allegations of fraud, of theft, of corruption. These are not charges to be made lightly, and Mrs. Brennan is not making them lightly. She has evidence, which she will present. And then we, as a community, will decide what action to take." Kate stood, her crutch under one arm, and told her story. She started with Thomas's death and the forged debts. She showed the papers Walter had used to steal her husband's claim, pointing out inconsistencies in the signatures, dates that didn't match Thomas's work schedule. Several miners in the audience nodded, recognizing the fraud. Then she told them about the Whisper House and what she'd found there. She read from Beatrice Walsh's letters, not all of them, not the most damning accusations, but enough to establish that Beatrice had owned a mine and believed she'd been robbed. She showed them the ore sample, passing it around so everyone could see the silver gleaming in the rock. "This came from the mine beneath the Whisper House," Kate said, her voice voice steady and clear. A mine that's been hidden for 20 years. A mine that Beatrice Walsh discovered and operated. A mine that her brother Robert stole from her with the help of attorney Henry Caldwell, or possibly his father. A mine that may have cost Beatrice Walsh her life when she tried to expose the theft. The church erupted, people shouting questions, accusations, denial. Walter Morrison stood, his voice booming. "This is slander. My attorney will—" "Your attorney is the one being accused." Pastor Davies cut him off sharply. "You'll have your turn to speak, Mr. Morrison. Sit down." Surprisingly, Walter sat. The force of Davies' moral authority, backed by a church full of witnesses, was stronger than Walter's bluster. Henry Caldwell stood next, his voice smooth and reasonable. "These are serious accusations, Mrs. Brennan, but they're based on 20-year-old letters and a piece of rock that could have come from anyone. You claim there's a mine under your property, yet you offer no proof. You claim my firm was involved in fraud, yet you can't even prove that my father had any dealings with Beatrice Walsh." "Then let's prove it," Kate said, her heart hammering. "Let's go to the Whisper House right now with witnesses and open that mine. If I'm lying, you'll have proof. If I'm telling the truth, so will everyone else." Caldwell's mask slipping for just a moment. Kate saw calculation in his eyes, saw him weighing options. If he refused, he'd look guilty. If he agreed, he'd have to contend with whatever evidence Kate had found. But he was trapped by his own confidence, his certainty that he could control any situation. "Very well," Caldwell said. "Let's go inspect this mine. And when we find nothing, Mrs. Brennan, I trust you'll apologize for these slanderous accusations." The procession that left the church was almost festive. Half the town came, eager for drama, for scandal, for something to break the monotony of mining town life. Kate rode in Pastor Davies' wagon, her children beside her, while behind them came miners and merchants, widows and workers, a whole community drawn by the promise of justice or vengeance depending on whose side they favored. Walter Morrison and Henry Caldwell rode ahead on horseback, trying to maintain dignity, but Kate could see the tension in their shoulders. They were worried. Good, they should be. The Whisper House looked different with witnesses around it. Less sinister, more pathetic. Just an old building falling apart. Nothing supernatural or threatening about it. Kate climbed down from the wagon, ignoring the pain in her leg, and led the crowd inside. The hole she'd torn in the floor was still there, covered by the canvas she'd left. Kate pulled it aside, revealing the darkness below. "The cellar," she said, "and below that, the mine." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several men came forward, miners, men who understood underground spaces. Kate recognized Jake Morrison, no relation to Walter despite the shared name, a shift supervisor at the Silver Crown mine known for his honesty. "I'll go down first," Jake volunteered, "with Mrs. Brennan's permission." "Please," Kate said, gesturing. Jake descended with a lantern, his movements efficient and professional. A minute later, his voice floated up. "There's a cellar down here, stone walls, well built, and there's a door in the western wall. Looks like mine entrance." The crowd pressed closer. Caldwell and Walter exchanged glances, their worry turning to visible fear. Kate felt a savage satisfaction. "Everyone who wants to see can come down," Pastor Davies announced. "But carefully. We're looking for truth, not trying to cause a cave-in." Over the next hour, perhaps 20 people descended into the cellar and entered the mine. They came back up with reports that confirmed everything Kate had said. A working mine, properly shored, with visible silver ore in the wall. The seam Kate had found was examined by 3 different miners, all of whom confirmed it was good ore worth extracting. By mid-afternoon, there was no doubt. The mine existed. It had value. Beatrice Walsh had been telling the truth. "This doesn't prove Caldwell was involved," Walter blustered, his face sheen with sweat despite the cool March air. "This doesn't prove anything except that there's an old mine on property." "It proves Mrs. Brennan was telling the truth about the mine," Pastor Davies said, "which suggests she's telling the truth about the rest. The letters, the theft, He paused significantly. "Suspicious death." That was when Dr. Hewitt had stepped forward. Kate hadn't known he was in the crowd, hadn't seen him enter the church, but there he was, holding papers in his hand. "I examined Beatrice Walsh's body 20 years ago," Hewitt announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. "I was told her death was natural. I was told to certify it as heart failure and not ask questions. But I had questions. I've had questions for 20 years. He held up the papers. "These are my original examination notes. They show evidence of poison, symptoms consistent with arsenic. I was young. I was scared. I kept silent. I'm not keeping silent anymore." The crowd's murmur turned to an angry buzz. Poisoning, murder. This had gone from property dispute to something far dark. Caldwell's face had gone white. "Those notes are fabricated. Dr. Hewitt has no credibility." "I have the original death certificate," Hewitt interrupted, "signed by the coroner, who at the time was receiving regular payments from your father's law firm. I've checked the record." "Want to explain why a coroner was on your family's payroll, Mr. Caldwell?" That was when Walter broke. "This is your fault," he snarled at Caldwell, grabbing the lawyer's arm. "You said this was handled. You said there was no evidence. You said—" "Shut up," Caldwell hissed, trying to pull away. But Walter was past caring about strategy. Months of pressure, the threat of exposure, the reality of standing in front of witnesses who were now looking at him with suspicion, turning to hatred. It all broke something in him. "You killed her," Walter shouted at Caldwell. "You and your father killed Beatrice Walsh because she wouldn't stop talking about the mine. Just like you wanted to kill this one." He pointed at Kate. "I told you we should just let her rot brought in that house. But no, you had to try to silence her the same way. Morrison, stop talking, Caldwell ordered. His lawyer's composure finally cracked, but it was too late. The confession, partial, panic, but damning, hung in the air. The crowd had heard. Pastor Davies had heard. Jake Morrison and Dr. Hewitt had heard. Witnesses, dozens of witnesses, who would testify to what Walter had just said. Kate stood perfectly still, afraid to move, afraid to breathe, afraid this moment would shatter like glass if she did anything to disturb it. She'd wanted justice. She'd wanted exposure. She'd gotten both in a single, carelessly shouted sentence. Sheriff Tom Crawford, who'd been standing at the back of the crowd, stepped forward. He was a portly man, not known for courage, usually under Caldwell's thumb, but even he couldn't ignore what had just happened in front of half the town. Mr. Morrison, Mr. Caldwell, he said heavily, I'm going to need you both to come with me. There are some questions that need answering about Beatrice Walsh's death and about what happened to Mrs. Brennan in this house 4 nights ago. On what charge? Caldwell demanded, his voice strained but still trying for authority. On suspicion of conspiracy to commit murder, Crawford said, 20 years ago and 4 days ago. Based on Mr. Morrison's statement just now and the evidence presented by Dr. Hewitt, Kate watched as Henry Caldwell and Walter Morrison were led away, both men surrounded by townspeople who'd gone from spectators to guards, making sure neither man could flee. She watched until they were out of sight, until the crowd began to disperse, people talking excitedly about what they'd witnessed, already turning the day's events into story, into legend. Then her legs gave out. She sat down hard on the porch of the Whisper House, her crutch clattering beside her, and started to shake. Pastor Davies sat beside her, his old hand on her shoulder. You did it, he said quietly. You got them. Did I? Kate asked, her voice numb. They haven't been convicted. They have money. They have lawyers, other lawyers. This could drag on for years. Perhaps, Davies acknowledged, but you've exposed them, made their crimes public. Even if they escape legal punishment, they're finished in this county. No one will trust them. No one will do business with them. And most importantly, he squeezed her shoulder, you've made it impossible for them to hurt you or your children. They're being watched now. Everyone knows what they did. That's protection, Mrs. Brennan. That's victory, even if it doesn't feel like it yet. Kate nodded slowly, letting it sink in. She'd survived. Her children were safe. The mine was proven. Beatrice Walsh's murder was exposed. It wasn't perfect justice, but it was something. It was enough. What happens now? She asked. Now? Davies stood, offering her his hand. Now you go collect your children from my rectory, and you figure out how to run a silver mine, because that property is legally yours, which means that mine is yours. Congratulations, Mrs. Brennan. You're a mine owner. Kate let him pull her to her feet. She looked at the Whisper House, her mine, her future, and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. Real, solid, complicated hope. They'd tried to bury her, but like Beatrice before her, like silver in the ground, Kate Brennan had refused to stay buried, and now she would build something from the ruins they'd left her. Something that would last. The trial of Henry Caldwell and Walter Morrison for conspiracy to commit murder in the death of Beatrice Walsh became the most sensational event in Nevada territorial history that year. It took 3 months to bring them before a judge. 3 months during which Kate lived in a strange limbo between poverty and potential wealth, her children safe in Pastor Davies' rectory, while she tried to understand what it meant to own a silver mine. The territorial prosecutor, a sharp-eyed man named Marcus Webb, who'd made his career fighting mining company corruption, took personal charge of the case. He arrived from Carson City 2 weeks after Walter's public confession, interviewed Kate for 6 hours straight, read every page of Beatrice's letters, examined Dr. Hewitt's notes, and declared that he had enough to convict. But I'll be honest with you, Mrs. Brennan, Webb said, sitting across from her in Pastor Davies' study. They have money, they have connection, and murder cases from 20 years ago are hard to prove, especially when the victim was cremated and there's no body to examine. What we have is circumstantial evidence, a coerced confession, and the testimony of people the defense will try to discredit. This won't be easy. Nothing has been easy, Kate replied, but we're still here. That counts for something. Webb smiled grimly. Yes, it does. While the legal machinery ground slowly forward, Kate focused on the practical reality of her situation. She owned the Whisper House and the land it sat on, which meant she owned the mine beneath it. But owning a mine and operating a mine were very different things. She hired a mining engineer from Virginia City, a gruff, honest man named Samuel Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, who came recommended by Pastor Davies. Chen spent 3 days surveying the mine, measuring the silver seam, assessing the timber supports, and calculating potential yield. His report was both encouraging and daunting. You've got perhaps $5,000 worth of silver in that seam at current prices, he told Kate. Maybe more if the vein continues deeper. But extraction costs money. You need proper equipment. You need workers. You need processing facilities. Even a small operation like this requires capital you don't have. How much capital? Kate asked. Chen did calculations on a piece of paper. To do it right, $3,000 minimum. And that's assuming you can find workers willing to work for a woman mine owner, which he trailed off delicately, which was unlikely in 1910 Nevada. Kate finished silent. Women could own property, could inherit mines, but actually operating them, managing male workers, that was different. And men didn't take orders from women easily, especially not from a one-legged widow with 7 children. But Kate had learned something in her months of fighting. The word unlikely wasn't the same as impossible. She still still had $500 left from Beatrice's hidden cash. It wasn't enough to operate the mine properly, but it was enough to do something smaller, more clever. She spent 2 weeks talking to every miner who'd lost work when the Silver Crown mine had reduced operations, offering them a partnership that was almost unheard of in mining country. I can't pay standard wages, she told them honestly, but I'll give you a percentage of the silver we extract. You keep 20% of whatever you mine. I keep 80% to cover equipment costs and my own investment. If the mine plays out, you've lost nothing but time. If it's as rich as the engineer thinks, you'll make more than wage work would ever pay. Most men laughed at her. Some were insulted by the offer, but a few, men who were desperate enough, progressive enough, or just curious enough, agreed. Within 3 weeks, Kate had a crew of 5 miners working the Whisper House mine on a profit-sharing basis, something that would become more common in later years, but in 1910 was radical enough to be scandalous. She moved back into the Whisper House with her children once the mine entrance was properly secured and the main floor made safe. Daniel's health continued to improve with regular meals and Dr. Hewitt's ongoing care, which the doctor provided at reduced cost as his way of atoning for 20 years of silence. The other children adapted to their strange new life, living in a house that breathed above a mine that was slowly, carefully being worked. The silver came out in increments. Nothing dramatic, no massive strikes, just steady, honest work producing steady, modest returns. By the end of the first month, Kate's miners had extracted $800 worth of ore. By the end of the second month, $1,200. After paying the miners their share and covering costs, Kate was left with perhaps $300 profit each month. It wasn't wealth, but it was stability. It was enough to feed her children properly, to buy warm clothes for the coming winter, to slowly repair the Whisper House room by room. It was enough to survive with dignity, and that was more than many widows had. The trial began in late May, held in the territorial courthouse in Carson City, because no one trusted a Silver Ridge jury to be impartial. Kate traveled there with Pastor Davies, leaving her children in Mrs. Chen's care, and spent 4 days testifying about everything that had happened. She told the court about Thomas's death and the forged debts. She presented Beatrice's letters and read them aloud in a steady voice that didn't waver even when describing murder. She showed them the mine via photographs and surveyor's maps, proving it existed and had value. She recounted her flight through the darkness, Walter and Caldwell's voices pursuing her, the attempt to trap her underground. The defense attorney, an expensive Carson City lawyer named Reginald Hartford, tried to destroy her credibility. He emphasized her poverty, her desperation, her motive to fabricate accusations against wealthy men. He suggested the letters might be forgeries. He pointed out that Kate had never actually seen Walter and Caldwell in the mine that night, had only heard voices she claimed were theirs. But then Dr. Hewitt testified, and Jake Morrison, the honest mine supervisor, testified about what he'd seen in the mine, and Pastor Davies testified about Walter's public confession. And one by one, other witnesses came forward, people who'd known Beatrice Walsh, who'd seen her final months, who'd questioned her convenient death, but had been too afraid to speak. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The jury deliberated for 3 days. The verdict was guilty on conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty on conspiracy to commit theft, but not guilty on murder charge. There simply wasn't enough physical evidence to prove Beatrice had been poisoned, despite Dr. Hewitt's testimony. It was partial justice, but it was justice nonetheless. Henry Caldwell was sentenced to 15 years in territorial prison. Walter Morrison, who'd only been guilty of conspiracy in the recent events and hadn't been involved in Beatrice's death, received 5 years. Both men were ordered to pay restitution to Kate, to Beatrice's estate, to other victims of their fraudulent scheme who were now coming forward. Kate sat in the courtroom and watched them led away in chains, feeling nothing, no triumph, no satisfaction, just exhaustion and a strange sort of peace. It was over. Finally, after months of fighting, it was over. After the trial, Kate received an unexpected visitor at Pastor Davies' home where she was staying during the proceeding. A well-dressed woman in her 50s, accompanied by a younger woman who carried a notebook. "Mrs. Brennan," the older woman said, extending her hand. "I'm Margaret Hayes, president of the Nevada Women's Suffrage Association. And this is Josephine Clark, a reporter for the Carson City Appeal. We've been following your case with great interest." Kate shook their hands warily, unsure what they wanted. "Your fight," Hayes continued, "has become something larger than perhaps you realized. You're not the only widow who's been defrauded by powerful men, not the only woman who's had to fight legal systems designed to protect men's property rights over women. Your story, your victory, has inspired women across the territory." "I didn't do it to inspire anyone," Kate said honestly. "I did it to survive. That's what makes it powerful," Clark said, her pencil poised over her notebook. "You didn't set out to be a reformer. You just refused to accept injustice. Would you be willing to speak at some of our association meetings, tell Tell your story. Help us make the case for women's rights, for property protections, for legal reforms, for suffrage itself. Kate thought about Beatrice Walsh, dying alone, her testimony carved in stone where no one would hear it for 20 years. She thought about all the other women whose stories had been buried, whose fights had been lost because they'd fought alone. Yes, she said, I'll speak. Over the next 6 months, Kate became an unlikely advocate. She spoke at suffrage meetings, at labor rallies, at church gatherings. She told her story, not embellished, not made heroic, just honest. A widow with 7 children who'd been robbed and had fought back. She showed Beatrice's letters, explained how legal systems could be manipulated to steal from the vulnerable, argued that women needed the vote to protect themselves from men like Caldwell and Morrison. She was not a natural speaker. She was blunt where others were eloquent, practical where others were passionate, but her very ordinariness made her effective. She was proof that normal women, poor women, damaged women could stand up to power and win. The Whisper House mine continued to produce, not spectacularly, but steadily. Kate's profit-sharing arrangement with her miners became a model that other small operations began to copy. By the end of 1910, Kate was no longer poor. She wasn't wealthy. The mine would never make her wealthy, but she had enough to feed her children, enough to repair the house properly, to make it warm and dry and safe, enough to hire a tutor for the older children, to ensure Daniel and the others received educations that would give them opportunities beyond mining, enough to establish a small fund, she called it the Beatrice Walsh Memorial Fund, that provided emergency assistance to widows in Silver Ridge who found themselves in circumstances similar to what she and Beatrice had faced. The Whisper House stopped being cursed. It became instead a symbol. The house where a widow had hidden evidence for 20 years. The house where another widow had found that evidence and used it to bring down corrupt men. The house that breathed not with malice, but with memory, with testimony, with the stubborn refusal of women to be erased. Kate kept Beatrice's letters in a glass case in the main room, displayed where anyone could read them. She carved Beatrice's name above the fireplace. Beatrice Walsh, 1856 to 1891. She told the truth. Eventually, someone listened. Pastor Davies performed a memorial service for Beatrice 2 years after the trial, attended by 200 people who'd never known her but wanted to honor what she represented. Kate read from the letters, her voice steady, and felt that maybe, finally, Beatrice could rest. Daniel recovered fully, growing into a tall, serious young man who wanted to be a lawyer. Like the one who helped Mama, he said, meaning Marcus Webb, and Kate's heart swelled with pride. Rose and Lily became inseparable advocates for women's suffrage, handing out pamphlets and arguing politics with anyone who'd listen. Samuel, Margaret, and Patrick grew up in a house that was no longer haunted by poverty and fear. And baby Grace, who'd known only hunger and cold in her first months, grew into a sturdy, happy child who loved to explore the sealed-off sections of the mine with a lantern, pretending to discover treasure. Kate's own reputation evolved. She was no longer that poor widow or the crippled woman. She was Kate Brennan, mine owner, advocate, survivor. Some people admired her. Others, particularly men who didn't like women stepping outside traditional roles, resented her. Kate didn't care. She'd learned that survival mattered more than approval. In 1914, when Kate was 34, Nevada granted women limited suffrage, the right to vote in school board elections and on taxation issues. It wasn't full suffrage, not yet, but it was progress. Kate voted for the first time in her life, marking her ballot with a hand that didn't shake, thinking of Beatrice and all the other women who died before they could see this day. The mine played out in 1916. The silver seam that had seemed so promising simply ended, pinching off into worthless rock. Kate's miners helped her seal the tunnels properly, making them safe but inaccessible, preserving them as historical record rather than active operation. The last silver extracted from the Whisper House mine was formed into a medallion that Kate had inscribed with Beatrice's words, "This house is my witness." She wore it every day for the rest of her life. Without the mine income, Kate had to adapt again. She sold the Whisper House, no longer cursed, now almost famous, to a mining history enthusiast for a good price. With that money and her savings, she bought a small boarding house in Silver Ridge, one that catered specifically to widows and single women who needed affordable lodging. It was appropriate somehow. She'd spent her life fighting for women's survival. Now she'd spend it providing one small piece of that survival, a safe place to sleep. Her children grew and scattered. Daniel did become a lawyer, working for the territorial government on labor rights cases. Rose married a newspaper editor and continued her suffrage work. Lily became a teacher. Samuel returned to mining, but as an engineer, helping improve safety conditions. Margaret became a nurse. Patrick ran the boarding house with Kate until he was old enough to open his own business. Grace, the baby who'd survived on thin milk and determination, became a doctor, one of Nevada's first female physicians. Kate lived to see Nevada grant full suffrage to women in 1914 and to see the 19th Amendment ratified in 1920. She voted in every election she could, always thinking of Beatrice, always thinking of the long road from testimony carved in stone to ballots cast in freedom. She died in 1932 at the age of 52, surrounded by her 7 children and 18 grandchildren. Her wooden prosthetic, worn and patched, stood in the corner of her room like a soldier finally relieved of duty. Her obituary in the Carson City Appeal called her a pioneer of women's rights and an advocate for the vulnerable. But Kate would have preferred a simpler epitaph, the one her children carved on her headstone next to Thomas's in the Silver Ridge Cemetery. Catherine Brennan, she fought, she won, she remembered. And beneath that, a second line, in memory of Beatrice Walsh, who spoke first. 20 years after Kate Brennan's death, her grandson, Daniel's son, named Thomas after the grandfather he'd never met, stood in front of what remained of the Whisper House. It was 1952, and he was a historian working on a book about women's rights movements in the American West. His grandmother's story had always fascinated him, but he'd never seen the place where it had all begun. The house was barely standing. The new owners had maintained it as a historical site for a few years after buying it from Kate, but eventually the cost became too much, and they'd abandoned it. Now it was slowly returning to the earth, boards gray and warped, roof partially collapsed, windows long since shattered by wind and time. Thomas walked carefully through what remained of the front door, his footsteps echoing on floorboards that groaned with age. The main room was much as his grandmother had described it in the interviews he conducted with her before her death. The massive stone fireplace still standing, though blackened by years of disuse. The floor where she'd torn boards away to discover the cellar had been repaired at some point, but Thomas knew where to look. He'd brought tools. Carefully, respectfully, he pried up the boards and shone his flashlight into the darkness below. The cellar was still there, untouched since the mine had been sealed in 1916. Thomas descended the wooden ladder he'd brought, his historian's heart racing with the thrill of primary source, of touching the actual places where history had happened. The cellar was exactly as his grandmother had described. Stone walls, carefully fitted, dry air that smelled of earth and metal, and on the eastern wall, faint but still visible, the words Beatrice Walsh had carved. To whoever finds this, I am Beatrice Walsh. This house is my wit. 1890. Thomas traced the letters with his finger, feeling the connection across decades. Two women, both widows, both fighting systems designed to destroy them, both refusing to be silent. He spent the day documenting everything, photographing the cellar, the sealed mine entrance, the carving. He collected samples of the stone, the timber supports, anything that could be preserved in the Nevada Historical Society's archive. His book would need this, would need the physical evidence to make the story real for readers who couldn't imagine what his grandmother had endured. As the sun began to set, Thomas climbed back up to the main room. He was about to leave when he noticed something he'd missed before, a piece of paper wedged into a crack in the stone fireplace, protected from weather by its position. He pulled it out carefully. It was a letter written in his grandmother's firm handwriting, dated 1928. To whoever finds this, it began, and Thomas smiled at the echo of Beatrice's words. My name is Catherine Brennan, and this house saved my life. He read, standing there in the fading light, his grandmother's voice clear in every word. I came here with 7 children and nothing else. I was desperate, frightened, and I thought this house would be my grave. Instead, it became my fortress. It held secrets that needed telling, gave me weapons to fight injustice, and taught me that the past speaks if you are brave enough to listen. Beatrice Walsh left her testimony carved in stone because she knew paper could be destroyed, memories could be denied, but stone endures. I'm leaving this letter as my own testimony, my own addition to what this house remembers. If you're reading this, you probably came looking for the story of the widow who found silver and fought corruption. That story is true, but it's not complete. The complete story is about women helping women across time. Beatrice helped me without knowing I existed. I tried to help others in her name. And perhaps you, reading this, will help someone I'll never meet. The house breathes. People said that to frighten me, but I learned it was true in a different way. It breathes with the voices of everyone who fought here, survived here, refused to be forgotten here. Listen to what it tells you. The mine is sealed now. The silver is gone. But what we found here, Beatrice and I, wasn't really the silver. It was proof that we matter, that our lives, our fights, our refusals to surrender had value, that history isn't just the story of powerful men, but also of ordinary women who became extraordinary because they had no other choice. Take care of this place if you can, not because it's where I won, but because it's where Beatrice lost, and her loss mattered as much as my victory. Every fight matters, even the ones that fail, because they make the next fight possible. Remember us, tell our story, and when you meet someone who's fighting alone against impossible odds, help them, because none of us really fights alone. We fight with the voices of everyone who came before, everyone who refused to be silent, everyone who left testimony in stone and paper and memory. This house is our witness. Let it witness for you too. Catherine Brennan, 1928. Thomas carefully folded the letter and placed it in his document case. It would go in his book, of course, but first it would go to his mother, Daniel's wife, who'd loved Kate fiercely and had stories of her own to tell. He left the Whisper House as the last light faded, the building a dark silhouette against the Nevada sky. It wouldn't last much longer. Another decade, maybe 2, and it would collapse entirely, returning to the earth that had held its secrets for so long. But that was all right. The house had done its job. It had kept Beatrice's testimony safe until Kate could find it. It had sheltered Kate and her children until they could stand on their own. And now it had yielded its final secret, Kate's letter, to someone who would make sure both women's stories survive. Buildings don't last forever, but stories do. Thomas's book, published in 1954, was titled The Whisper House: Two Widows and the Fight for Justice in Mining Country. history. It became required reading in Nevada school, introducing generations of students to Kate and Beatrice. The letters, both Beatrice's and Kate's, were preserved in the Nevada Historical Society. The Whisper House itself finally collapsed in 1963, but by then it didn't matter. The story had been saved. Kate's children ensured their mother's legacy continued. Daniel's law practice specialized in representing widows and vulnerable clients. Rose's work with the suffrage movement had helped secure women's voting rights. Lily's students learned about the importance of standing up to injustice. Samuel's improvements to mine safety saved countless lives. Margaret's nursing care focused on poor families who couldn't afford expensive doctors. Patrick's boarding houses provided affordable housing for women across Nevada. And Grace, the baby who'd survived on determination and thin milk, became a doctor who treated patients regardless of their ability to pay. They all told their mother's story, and their children told it, and their grandchildren. Until Kate Brennan and Beatrice Walsh became not just individuals, but symbols, proof that ordinary people could fight power and win, that justice delayed wasn't always justice denied, that women's voices mattered even when systems tried to silence them. The silver from the Whisper House mine, the silver that had caused so much pain and inspired so much courage, was long gone. But it had done more than provide temporary wealth. It had provided proof that Beatrice had been telling the truth, proof that Kate was worth listening to, proof that sometimes the ground beneath your feet holds not just minerals, but testimony, evidence, the accumulated weight of injustice waiting to be exposed. In 1975, the Nevada State Legislature designated the site of the Whisper House as a historical landmark. A small park was created with plaques telling the story of Beatrice Walsh and Kate Brennan. Tourists came, took photos, read the words carved in replica stones since the originals had crumbled. It became a pilgrimage site for women's rights advocates, for people fighting their own battles against corrupt systems, for anyone who needed to remember that victory was possible. The park includes a memorial wall with the names of both women and their children, celebrating not just their fight, but their survival, their continuation, because that ultimately was what mattered most. Not just that Kate had won, but that she'd lived to raise her children, to see them thrive, to build something lasting from the ruins men had tried to bury her. The Whisper House no longer stands, but on quiet nights, visitors to the memorial park report hearing something, not supernatural, not frightening, just a sound like wind moving through the old mine tunnels that still exist beneath the earth. A breathing sound, the house remembering, the ground testifying. Somewhere in those tunnels, sealed and dark, the stone walls still bear Beatrice's carved message. Somewhere in archives and museums, Kate's letters rest in climate-controlled cases. Somewhere in the memories of descendants and students and readers, their stories live. And somewhere in the continuing fight for justice and dignity and the right to be heard, Kate Brennan and Beatrice Walsh are still fighting, still refusing to be silenced, still bearing witness, because that's what testimony does. It endures. It speaks across decades, across generations, across the vast distance between desperate widows in 1890 and 1910, and anyone reading their stories today. It says, I was here, I mattered, I fought, I survived, and in surviving, I made it possible for you to fight too. The house remembered, the ground testified, and the story, like silver and stone, remained.